and the global challenge of curing infectious disease. Anthony Fauci is America's top doctor on infectious disease. He tells me his nightmare pandemic scenario. We are live on Facebook at Voice of America and want your comments and questions. And this is very bad news, but Ebola, it's back. So far, though, it's confined to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where at least 58 people have been infected, 25 of them already dead from the virus. Now, it's a far cry from the more than 28,000 people infected in West Africa in the last outbreak between 2014 and 2016. And lessons learned from that deadly outbreak are helping contain the disease now. But there are no guarantees. Right now, doctors are conducting real-time clinical trials, testing a new vaccine, but that won't help those who don't have the vaccine or who are already infected. VOA medical correspondent Carol Pearson reports on the vaccination effort.
People in Bikoro celebrate this man's recovery from Ebola. Wangi Nondi says he developed a fever after caring for his brother who died from Ebola. But Nondi is better now after receiving the Ebola vaccine. Doctors in Congo say they have not been able to vaccinate everyone who has been exposed to the virus, and they're still finding new cases that are not linked to cases they have already confirmed. This means the virus is still actively spreading, and health workers still don't have an accurate picture of what's going on. Congo's vaccination campaign is targeting more than 1,000 health workers, along with those who have had contact with people who developed the virus. They use a ring approach, where health workers identify newly diagnosed Ebola patients and then set out locating people they've been in contact with, from family and friends to neighbors and work colleagues. The vaccine they're using was developed during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It's not licensed yet, but it has proven to be safe and effective.
What it does, it teaches the immune system to recognize those Ebola proteins on the surface of this modified virus, and in doing so, create a protective response against that.
Because the vaccine can only be tested when there's an Ebola outbreak, there are many unknowns.
What we're trying to do now is to establish how effective is this vaccine. Do you need 1 dose or 2 doses to be protective? And once you've been injected or vaccinated with this, how long does that protection last for as well?
Containing the virus is difficult because many areas impacted by the outbreak are close to heavily used waterways. It started in rural Bikoro, then moved to Mbandaka, a busy port city along the Congo River. People use the river to bring produce to the country's capital, Kinshasa. Health workers say keeping Ebola out of heavily populated areas is critical to containing this outbreak.
Carol Pearson is with us to tell us more about how the response to this Ebola outbreak is different from a few years ago. Nice to see you, Carol.
Thanks, Greta.
Before we get to the differences, is it contained? In your report, you talk about how important it is to contain it, but is it contained, or is there a real risk with transportation that Ebola is going to spread further beyond this nation?
Well, there's a real risk, not only with transportation, but, for example, the port city of Mbandaka has 1.2 million people in it. And the reports from the WHO say they're still finding people who have the disease not related to people that they've already discovered. So it's still spreading somewhat. And
they haven't identified the source of the spreading. I mean, it starts someplace, but naturally it sounds like there are different hot spots.
Yeah, there are. There are about 3 different hot spots right now. And of course, you know, when you're in a small town, you maybe interact with 15 people a day or something like that. You would interact with people in your village. If you're in a large city, you interact with so many more people.
And with people traveling from a village to a city, if on occasion, then you've got that risk.
Yes, because they also, Mbandaka, the port city, is right, it's upriver, where, north of Kinshasa and Brazzaville, which, are the 2 major cities that are south of it, and they're trying to desperately keep it out of these cities.
So tell me the response today in this outbreak to the one that was at West Africa.
There are lots and lots of differences. First of all, in West Africa, they had never experienced that disease before, and they were just coming out of wars. And the tribal people did not trust the healthcare workers who came in these, get-ups and everything. The thing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, their war ended around 1997. Their government is relatively stable. It's still a poor country. However, 80% of the people can read. They have higher education. They've had experience with this before.
Do they have the money for the vaccine, and is there enough vaccine for the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Merck has promised that there will be enough vaccine. They have shipped over.
Once you get it, is a vaccine helpful? I mean, if you've already got Ebola, you better hope for something more than a vaccine.
You can't. The best thing they found out in the last is to treat the symptoms. Like they were using a serum called ZMapp, which is hard to make, but that was effective. They also found that if you just keep the electrolyte system, the electrolytes up by even in something that we drink with sports drinks or something like that, but have enough necessary salts in your body, it combats the dehydration that you get, because the major symptom of Ebola, you have fever, it's a hemorrhagic fever, but the major thing is that you have massive diarrhea, and that's very
much
critical.
like with cholera and so many other diseases.
Yes.
Anyway, Carol, thank you very much. Ebola was identified in 1976, but there is a more deadly, more common disease that has stumped doctors for centuries: influenza. It's now been 100 years since the 1918 flu pandemic. It incubated among military personnel confined in closed spaces while fighting World War I. Now, in 1918, 1/3 of the world's population, 500 million people, were infected with the flu. 50 million of them died. And according to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the 2017-2018 flu season was the worst in the last decade. Dr. Fauci told me the conditions for a similar global pandemic are just as ripe today as they were 100 years ago.
Okay, this is a new truck, which was launched today, and musical outcome. Thank you. Okay.
What is God?
Big burst in and out. Okay, you can lean back. Sorry.
That's fine. Life-saving girlfriend's name?
Myra, M-A-Y.
With our son Jaden, he had the flu, and then our daughter Hazel got it. She had the worst. It was like she had 103, 102 temperature, and then I just started getting it. The first, I got like a super horrible cough, and then it started to turn into a headache, and then body aches, and then the fever, and then the worst part was throwing up. I couldn't sleep through the night. I was throwing up all night, and I thought it was something more serious than the flu, because I've never had the flu like this before. I've never had to throw up or even come into the hospital for the flu. So
Finding solutions to get the medicine to the people who need it is the responsibility of governments and non-governmental organizations. Ambassador Mark Legon is the Chief Policy Officer for one of those non-governmental organizations, Friends of the Global Fight. It works to support the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Ambassador Legon has also worked inside the United States government as ambassador at large to combat human trafficking. Nice to see you, sir.
Very nice to be with you.
So the biggest crisis facing us, in your mind, in this area is what?
Well, I think political will. We've made a huge dent in AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria as the major communicable diseases. We need to finish the job. As the head of the Global Fund, Peter Sands, says, if we're worried about infectious disease of all sorts, Ebola, influenza, and so on, we should fight the ones that are the worst now and put the problem to bed.
Well, Dr. Fauci told me that influenza is something we're just not ready for ever because we don't know what the virus is going to be. So that's always sort of a dangerous game, and of course it can have such enormous consequences. In terms of AIDS for instance, in Africa, during the Bush administration, President Bush was very ambitious with a program to fight AIDS. How's that worked out?
It's been enormously effective. President Bush, what's been a bipartisan effort, launched PEPFAR, the Presidential Emergency Response on AIDS. And we've moved from a situation in 2005 when about 1.9 million people were dying of AIDS each year down to a level of about 1 million, halving the death rate by 2016. And that has been done by two things. One, the U.S. with a massive, generous program that works closely with governments and civil society, but also getting other countries to kick in and share the burden through the Global Fund, where other countries need to match the U.S. 2-to-1.
Which is sort of interesting because sometimes, at least is my recollection time, is that the United States wants to be generous and help in a particular area, but that help may be rejected for some reason in some areas. They may not want it, whether it's political or they don't trust it. But I mean, there have been some instances where there's not a lot, but where there's been some sort of.
It's interesting when you look at the end of the Bush presidency. He had a controversial presidency. Some people had disagreements with his policies, but the place where the United States was most appreciated and his policies were most popular were in sub-Saharan Africa, the very place where there was the focus of those programs. We didn't do it because of that. We did it because there's a health security issue, because if there's a problem with infectious disease in the world, it affects us. But it was appreciated, and it still is.
It's sort of interesting that, a lot of American people may wonder why we're spending so much American dollars to help people around the world. And it's actually, at least in my humble opinion, twofold. One is because we're a good nation, and for humanitarian reasons, but as you point out, the other is national security, because some disease may start at some place, have an epidemic someplace, but in this day and age where everyone can hop on a plane and travel someplace, it can be in New York in 8 hours.
Well, I think you touched on exactly the two things. There's effectiveness, and then there's interests in U.S. security. So you can ask questions about international assistance programs or multilateral partnerships, but ones that work, like the PEPFAR program on HIV/AIDS, like the Global Fund, are the ones you should invest in. Global Fund, for instance, where the United States gets matched 2-to-1 by other donors, it's saved, by a conservative estimate, 22 million lives over the last 15 years. But it is a health security issue.
As I was preparing for this show, I read about tuberculosis. I've been to a tuberculosis clinic in Jordan, where there's, and I hadn't realized that tuberculosis was still such a scourge of the world. Then as I read more, is even here in the United States, you have tuberculosis, that the more dangerous places might be a homeless shelter, or where people, are living in poverty, in close quarters or in poverty, that here in the United States we have an issue.
Yeah, and it's something that, because you catch it by people who are coughing near you, it's very easy for those military officers, soldiers, business people traveling as students back and forth to spread it. Tuberculosis has existed for centuries. We have a way of treating it if people would stick with the treatment for the several months. And yet, 40% of those who have it, it hasn't been discovered, and they're carriers.
Why?
Look, a lot of people have it as a latent disease that they're not actually suffering from the severe conditions, but that they're carriers. There's a capacity issue around the world, which the United States is helping. But what's interesting is, in part because of the success of fighting HIV/AIDS and slowing the growth of that problem, now, as of 2015, TB is the biggest communicable disease killer, the biggest of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and the eighth killer of any sort in the world.
How about money? I mean, is there enough money for? I take it's always a challenge to try to get money to pay for these epidemics or to pay for vaccinations so that they don't have the epidemics.
There is the money there, and Congress has stood firm on steady funding over the last 5-6 years on this. The United States spends 1% of its federal budget on foreign assistance, and then only 0.25% on global health, an even smaller amount on AIDS, and yet it's had an enormous impact. And so it's a great investment. It's an investment in saving lives, economic futures for people around the world and trade partners for the United States. It definitely is a sign of the U.S. commitment to work with other countries.
It's sort of interesting because the United States has gotten criticism around the world, like many other nations. But the United States often doesn't get sort of the acknowledgement that it's doing so much on world health. When it has been doing so much, and I have to tip my hat to members of Congress, because I know that every time that they spend money on this, that they probably got constituents back home who are saying, "Why are you helping me here?"
Well, we always have to worry about problems at home and the dignity of people at home. But it is so inexpensive, person by person, to help save lives. It's been estimated that 8 million people have been prevented from dying from AIDS since the beginning of the PEPFAR program early in the Bush administration.
At what cost?
The United States has spent over a number of years about $6.6 billion.
Billion?
$6.6 billion. The U.S. should have a strong military, but compared to that budget, it's a small one, and it's only a small portion of 1% of the U.S. federal budget.
What about influenza? That's the one that's
It's a very good question, and Bill Gates is very concerned with having an ability to inoculate people for all forms of influenza. It may sound weird to talk about a case as you have 100 years ago, but think about it. Right at the end of World War I, when the world had confronted a major war, you had something that affected a fifth of the world's population, killed 50 million people, killed more than any wars of the whole 20th century. And that's the kind of thing that can pop up. We worry, rightly, of nuclear proliferation, things like the cases of North Korea and Iran, but it may be that the biggest security risk to the world and to the United States might be one of these sudden things. And as we have worked on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, we have prepared ourselves in the world for the kind of nimbleness to be able to deal with the new things that come next.
But the sort of disturbing aspect of it is that in World War I, if you want to come home from World War I, it probably took you 4 days, 5 days, 6 days to get home. And so, even so, it was slower to spread these things. Now everybody hops on airplanes. You could pick up something in one place, and you could be in Thailand, and then 3 hours later you can be in Beijing, and then 13 hours later you're in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely right. And that's why this is something that affects people here at home. Those who travel, those who serve in the military, those we want coming here to do business with us. They can bring these diseases here. That's why we need to fight them out in the world, and it is in our self-interest, not only the humanity of it.
All right, we have the tape of Dr. Fauci, and according to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the director of the United States National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, the 2017-2018 flu season was the worst in the last decade. Dr. Fauci told me the conditions for a similar global pandemic are just as ripe today as they were 100 years ago.
If you look at the plane schedules, we're 18 to 20 hours away from anywhere in the world. It's just anywhere you want to go. You want to go to China, it's an 18-hour trip. That goes all the way around. You want to come back, it's the same thing. So when you have particularly a respiratory-borne illness, which is the thing we worry about the most because that's what spreads easily and rapidly, and it is in confined places when people are in planes, when people are in schools, when people are at work. Travel itself is the thing that really is the showstopper when it comes to pandemics.
What keeps you awake at night, if anything?
Well, the thing that I worry about most as an infectious disease person is indeed a respiratory-borne virus that spreads easily, that has a high degree of what we call morbidity, making people sick, and mortality, can actually kill them. The one that always comes to mind is influenza, because influenza is a well-known human pathogen that spreads easily by respiratory. So I worry about the next influenza pandemic or a pandemic of a respiratory disease. Remember, we had SARS that was fortunate for us that there was a big outbreak, but then because of public health measures, we were able to contain it. But sometimes you can't contain these outbreaks very well purely by public health measures. And that's the reason why we need to continue to sharpen our capabilities of developing vaccines rapidly in response to pandemics.
Well, if you have an influenza, first of all, to have a vaccine, it would be the first step. That costs money. And then something like maybe Tamiflu to try to treat it or minimize the impact, that costs money too. What about some countries, like let's take some of the poorer countries in Africa. You get on an airplane and you go there and you spread something, and now what? Do they have the supply, the Tamiflu supply? Do they have the medical resources?
Short answer is no, they don't. And that's one of the things we really need to be concerned about, and one of the reasons why we are trying to develop what's called a universal influenza vaccine, namely a vaccine that is effective against any changing or drifting strain of influenza, as well as any major change which would lead to a pandemic. Because right now, we're in this somewhat compromised situation where we have to chase after pandemics. We react to them as opposed to preemptively being prepared for them. And the reason for that is that influenza particularly, which is the one we worry about the most, even normally from season to season, tends to drift or change, so that the vaccine that is available this year for this strain, next year the strain may change just enough to make it necessitating to get a new vaccine. Now, we do that in the developed world. We get a new vaccine every year. It's costly, but we do it. In a developing country that has so many other health problems, they almost can't afford to do that from year to year. Now, if a pandemic comes, they're going to be in a lot of trouble because they don't have the resources. I mean, the capacity to make vaccine for everyone in the world who would need it with an outbreak is just not there, because you have to rush to do it to catch up and respond. If you had a vaccine that you could stockpile, the way you stockpile measles vaccine, polio vaccine, smallpox vaccine, which thankfully we don't even need anymore, then you're way ahead of the game, particularly in the developing countries who would really have a problem with mobilizing immediately to respond to a pandemic.
Are all nations willing to take vaccines? I mean, I know there's been controversy with certain vaccines. That's the first question. The second question is that the flu vaccine, I took the flu shot last year. I got the flu and I was told it was, I don't know, 40% effective or something, and I fell on the bad side of the equation.
Well, yes, that's again getting back to the issue that we need to do better with influenza vaccines, which is the reason why we are working very hard now in a very concerted effort to develop this universal vaccine. And by universal, it means that it is against virtually all the strains. Now, if you look at how effective flu vaccine now, I must start off by saying always, it is always better to have some degree of protection than no protection at all. So if a vaccine is 40 to 50% effective or even 30% effective, it's better than not getting vaccinated at all. But we shouldn't be accepting a 30 to 40 to 50% as the end game. We should take the vaccine because it's better than nothing, but we need to push the envelope and get influenza vaccines that are in the 90+ effective.
How far are we from a universal vaccine?
I think it's years, Greta. I don't think that this is something that we're going to say we're going to have next year or the year after, because there are a lot of scientific questions that need to get answered about how you can actually get the body to make a response against something it doesn't naturally make a good response against, because the body easily makes a good immune response against that part of the influenza that changes from year to year. So if you hit it right with the right call on a vaccine, you're good for that year. What the body doesn't do very well is to make a response against the part of the influenza that doesn't change from year to year. So if we could figure out a way to induce the body to make a response against that constant part of the virus, we'd be much closer to the issue of a universal flu vaccine.
Now, we've been talking about pandemics where people spread it or catch it. Do you have any concern or is there any risk that this could be weaponized? That any rogue nation or rogue group would weaponize with viruses?
Well, there certainly is a risk, and that's the reason why back in 2001, after 9/11, when we had the anthrax attacks, even though that turned out to be a homegrown terrorist, that we put an extraordinary amount of money, investment, in developing a biodefense effort, which is very closely allied with what we do against naturally occurring microbes. But the indirect answer to your question, there certainly is a risk, which we have to be prepared for, that certain microbes can be weaponized.
A final thought. 50 years ago, June 4th, 1968, America awoke to the terrible news that another one of our political leaders was assassinated. In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, brother to President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963, was running for president of the United States. Robert Kennedy was gunned down after celebrating victory in the 1968 California presidential primary election. Kennedy had promised to end the Vietnam War. He had also rekindled a sense of optimism for many that was sparked when his brother John F. Kennedy was elected president. Robert Kennedy was killed just 2 months after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was also an inspiration for so many, adding to the civil unrest already underway in the United States in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy left behind a wife who was 3 months pregnant at the time and 10 other children. He was 42 years old. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.